Who were the prominent 19th-century American anti-imperialists who supported the Asian Exclusion Act?
Here's where things get messy. In the late 19th century, many prominent anti-imperialists, especially those aligned with the Anti-Imperialist League, simultaneously opposed overseas expansion while supporting Asian exclusion at home. The contradiction was striking, but common. Here are a few key figures who exemplified this tension. John Fiske, historian and philosopher, while not as prominent in the League, was part of the intellectual milieu that shaped its thinking. He opposed imperial conquest on moral and constitutional grounds, but supported racial hierarchies and exclusionary policies. He believed Anglo-Saxons were destined to lead civilization, and that other races, particularly Asians, were unfit for assimilation. Samuel Gompers, labor leader and AFL founder, was a staunch anti-imperialist, especially regarding the Philippines. Gompers also aggressively supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. His rationale was grounded in labor protectionism. He feared cheap Asian labor would undermine white American workers. He often framed his support for exclusion in economic, not racial terms, but the subtext was plainly xenophobic. Senator George F. Hoare, Republican of Massachusetts, was one of the Senate's loudest voices against the annexation of the Philippines. He championed constitutional principles and self-determination. However, he did not challenge the Chinese Exclusion Act, and likely supported it, at least tacitly. He saw Asian immigration as a separate issue, one about domestic labor and assimilation, not imperial conquest. William Jennings Bryan, a populist anti-imperialist, opposed the war in the Philippines but also supported Asian exclusion on both economic and cultural grounds. Like Gompers, he claimed to be protecting American workers and cultural cohesion. His anti-imperialism was nationalist in tone, not cosmopolitan. Charles Francis Adams Jr., grandson of John Quincy Adams, opposed American imperialism for violating Republican ideals. Yet Adams also supported racial segregation and Asian exclusion, viewing non-white races as incompatible with American democracy. The core contradiction: many anti-imperialists based their opposition on Republican principles or economic protectionism, but not on racial equality or human rights. So they could simultaneously decry conquering the Philippines while lobbying to keep Chinese immigrants out of California. Twain was an outlier in that he actually tied his anti-imperialism to a broader critique of racism and exclusion. Most others didn't.
I'm failing to see the contradiction between the republicanism of the anti-imperialists and those who preferred to exercise their right to freedom of association by excluding immigrants of any one type for any reason.
You're correct in observing that, within the framework of 19th-century American republicanism, there isn't necessarily a contradiction between opposing imperialism abroad and supporting immigration exclusion at home. Many anti-imperialists of that era, such as Samuel Gompers and William Jennings Bryan, viewed their stance as consistent with the principles of national self-determination and sovereignty. They believed that just as the United States should not impose its will on other nations, hence their opposition to imperialism, it also had the right to determine its own membership and cultural composition, which for them justified immigration restrictions. This perspective was rooted in a vision of the nation-state as a self-governing entity with the authority to define its own identity and policies. From a Hegelian standpoint, contradiction involves the presence of opposing forces or concepts within a system that drive its development through their resolution. In this context, the anti-imperialists' positions can be seen as part of a dialectical process where the tension between universal ideals, like self-determination, and particular policies, like exclusion, reflects the complexities of applying abstract principles to concrete political realities. Therefore, while modern perspectives might view the combination of anti-imperialism and immigration exclusion as contradictory, within the historical and philosophical context of the time, these positions were often seen as complementary aspects of a coherent political philosophy.
Compare and contrast 19th-century American Republican stance opposing imperialism and opposing open borders with 21st-century anarcho-capitalist supporters of Hans Hermann Hoppe's stance on Israel and their support for open borders.
The juxtaposition between 19th-century American anti-imperialists who opposed both imperial expansion and open borders, and 21st-century anarcho-capitalists like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who advocate for private property rights and controlled immigration, reveals both parallels and divergences rooted in their respective philosophical frameworks. 19th-century American anti-imperialists' philosophical foundation, grounded in classical republicanism, emphasizing national sovereignty, civic virtue, and self-governance. Opposition to imperialism, figures like Mark Twain and members of the American Anti-Imperialist League opposed overseas expansion, arguing that imperialism violated the principle of consent of the governed and threatened the moral fabric of the republic. Stance on immigration. Many anti-imperialists supported immigration restrictions, particularly against Asian populations, viewing them as culturally incompatible and a threat to social cohesion. This perspective was influenced by prevailing racial attitudes and a desire to maintain a homogeneous national identity. 21st-century anarcho-capitalists, for example, Hans Hermann Hoppe, philosophical foundation, rooted in anarcho-capitalism, advocating for a stateless society where all services, including law and order, are provided by private entities. Opposition to imperialism. Hoppe and like-minded thinkers oppose state-led imperialism, viewing it as an unjust extension of coercive state power. Stance on immigration. Contrary to some libertarian advocates for open borders, Hoppe argues that in a society respecting private property rights, unrestricted immigration equates to forced integration. He posits that property owners should have the authority to determine who may enter their domains, effectively supporting controlled immigration based on voluntary association. Similarities. Skepticism of state power. Both groups exhibit distrust toward expansive state authority, whether in the form of imperial conquest or enforced integration. Emphasis on self-determination. A shared belief in the right of communities or individuals to determine their associations and affiliations. Differences. Conceptualization of community. 19th-century anti-imperialists focused on national sovereignty and cultural homogeneity, often endorsing exclusionary policies at the national level. Role of the state. While anti-imperialists operated within a paradigm that accepted the state's role in enforcing immigration policies, anarcho-capitalists like Hoppe envision a stateless society where such decisions are decentralized and privatized. In summary, while both 19th-century anti-imperialists and 21st-century anarcho-capitalists like Hoppe oppose forms of coercive integration, be it imperialism or open borders, their justifications diverge significantly. The former stance is rooted in preserving national identity and sovereignty, often through state mechanisms, whereas the latter emphasizes individual property rights and voluntary association within a stateless framework.